My fiancée convinced me to move in with her parents to save money. But when I secretly learned their language and heard what they were planning, I recorded everything, called the FBI, and sent them to prison for 8 years. I'm 28 years old, I work in tech, and I need to get this story off my chest because what happened about a year and a half ago basically made me question everything I thought I knew about people and love. I guess I should start at the beginning. When I met Anastasia on a dating app like 3 years ago, she was beautiful, obviously, but she also seemed genuine, you know, not like those girls who are just looking for attention or whatever. We would talk for hours about everything, our dreams, our families, what we wanted in life. She worked at a clothing store and lived with her parents, which didn't seem weird to me because a lot of people her age do that to save money, especially if they come from another culture where it's more normal to stay home until you get married. We dated for a year and a half before I proposed. I know, it sounds fast, but when you think you found the right person, why wait? She said yes. We cried, we hugged, the whole romantic thing you see in movies. Her parents seemed happy too. Or so I thought at the time. Her mother, Galina, was super intense, from the first day I met her, like always asking questions about my job, how much I made, if I had savings, if my parents had properties, stuff like that. At the time, I thought it was just a protective mother wanting to make sure her daughter was going to be okay, you know? My own mother asked similar questions when she met my ex-girlfriends, so it didn't seem that out of the ordinary. Anastasia's father, Pavel, was quieter, but he also made me uncomfortable sometimes with the way he looked at me, like constantly evaluating me. They talked a lot in their language when I was around, which also seemed normal to me at first because, well, it's their native language and they're in their house. They have the right to speak however they want. I only knew like 3 words in that language, basic stuff like hello and thank you, nothing more. I had never bothered to learn it more deeply because Anastasia spoke perfect English and had never given me reasons to distrust her. After the engagement, Anastasia started pushing for us to move in together. But here comes the part that should have set off all the alarms. She wanted us to move into her parents' house. She said it was temporary, that it would only be for a few months until we saved enough for our own place, that her parents had plenty of space, and that in her culture it was normal for young couples to live with family before the wedding. I had my own apartment, a small but decent place that I paid for myself, and the idea of leaving it to move in with my in-laws didn't excite me at all. But Anastasia insisted and insisted, saying it would mean a lot to her family, that it was especially important to her mother, that refusing would be like a cultural insult. So I gave in, because I was in love and wanted her to be happy, and I thought a few months wouldn't kill anyone. I moved in mid-2023, I think it was June or July. I sold most of my furniture, put my important stuff in storage, and only took the essentials to Galina and Pavel's house. The house was big. They had a full basement that was supposedly going to be our private space, with a bedroom, a small bathroom, and an area we could use as a living room. It sounded good in theory. The first few days were weird but manageable. Galina cooked huge meals every day and expected us to eat together as a family, which is fine, I guess, but it was exhausting after working all day to have to sit through those long dinners where I didn't understand half of what was being said. That's when things started happening that made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't fully explain. For example, Galina started making comments about money constantly, like whether I had already added Anastasia to my bank account, whether we had talked about combining our finances, that in her culture, husbands share everything, and that I should demonstrate my commitment by doing the same. Before the wedding, Anastasia backed all this up, saying it was normal, that her cousin had done the same with her husband, that it was a show of trust. But something inside me told me not to do it. A little voice warning me to keep my finances separate for now. Thank God I listened to that voice. They also started pressuring me to give them money directly. Galina said they were paying more in utilities since I was living there, that food cost more, that they needed to make repairs to the house. She asked for specific amounts, like $800 one month, then $1,200 the next. I paid because, well, technically I was living in their house and consuming their resources, right? But the amounts kept going up, and the excuses became more elaborate. Pavel needed to fix his car. Anastasia needed money for a course she was supposedly going to take. Galina needed to go to the dentist, and her insurance didn't cover everything. Always something. What really started to bother me was that they spoke in their language all the time when I was around. Not just casual conversations, but long, intense discussions where I was clearly the topic because they would look at me while talking, sometimes laugh, or Galina would point at me and say things in a tone that sounded demanding or angry. When I asked them what they had said, Anastasia always downplayed it, saying it was nothing important, that they were just talking about family stuff. Not to worry. But you know what it feels like to be in a room where everyone is speaking a language you don't understand and they're clearly talking about you? It's horrible. It makes you feel paranoid and isolated at the same time. After like 2 months of living there, I made a decision that literally saved me from whatever they were planning. I started taking language classes in secret. There was an app I used on my commute to and from work, like 30 minutes each way. And I also found an online tutor I practiced with twice a week from my office during lunch. I didn't tell Anastasia or her family anything because something told me I needed to keep it secret. Looking back, I don't know exactly why I had that instinct, but thank God I did. Learning the language was hard, I'm not going to lie. The grammar was complicated and the pronunciation was terrible at first, but I was motivated because I needed to know what the hell they were saying about me. Like 3 or 4 months passed before I could understand basic conversations, and another 2 months before I could grasp the context of more complex discussions. By January 2024, like 6 or 7 months after moving in with them, I could understand probably 60 or 70% of what they said, especially if they spoke slowly or if the topic was something I was familiar with. One night in February, Anastasia and Galina had a huge argument in the kitchen. I was in the basement but could hear their voices rising, screaming in their language. Normally I would have stayed downstairs and I ignored the situation, but this time I walked up the stairs quietly and stood in the hallway where I could hear them, but they couldn't see me. And this is where everything changed. I took out my phone and started recording the audio. I don't know why exactly, I just felt I needed to do it, that this was important, and that I needed evidence of whatever was happening. The argument was about me, obviously. Galina was furious because, according to her, we were taking too long. She was saying things like, "It's been 8 months already, he still hasn't given you access to his accounts, he still hasn't signed anything, what are you waiting for? We need to move this faster before he figures it out." Anastasia responded that she was trying, that I was more cautious than they had thought, that she needed more time to convince me. Galina was shouting that we didn't have more time, that others were waiting their turn, that she had already invested too much money and effort in this, that Anastasia, I needed to make me sign something or marry her already so they could move forward with the paperwork. My heart was beating so hard, I thought they were going to hear it. I kept recording. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped my phone. Galina mentioned something about bank accounts, about getting my social security information, about transfers they needed to make before I could react. Anastasia said something about waiting until after the wedding because it would be easier legally, but Galina insisted they couldn't risk me changing my mind, that they had already wasted too much time on me compared to the previous ones. The previous ones. Those 2 words froze my blood. Previous ones? What the hell did previous ones mean? Were there other guys before me in this same situation? I kept recording for another 10 minutes until they finished the argument. I went down to the basement as quietly as possible and sat on the bed, shaking, trying to process what I had just heard. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, going over the recording again and again, understanding more with each listen, but I still needed help with some parts because my language level wasn't enough to catch all the details. The next day at work, I looked for Emma, a teammate who spoke the same language as Anastasia's family. Emma was from the same geographic region, but had immigrated legally with her family when she was a child and was now a U.S. citizen. I explained to her that I had a recording in that language and needed help translating it, that it was important but needed to be confidential. She agreed. Probably saw on my face that something serious was going on. We locked ourselves in a conference room during lunch, and I gave her my headphones to listen to the recording. I watched her expression change as she listened, from curiosity to shock to absolute horror. When it was over, she looked at me and said, "Christopher, this is really bad. This is criminal. They're talking about scamming you." We spent the next hour translating the entire conversation, her writing everything in English while I recorded her translation to have both versions. The complete translation was worse than I had imagined. They weren't just planning to get money from me. They were planning a complete marriage fraud scheme. The plan was for Anastasia to marry me, immediately get access to my accounts under the pretext of being spouses, transfer as much money as possible to offshore accounts, and then file false documents alleging domestic abuse or something similar to get a victim of domestic violence visa that would allow her to stay in the country even after the divorce. Galina specifically mentioned they needed my social security and credit card numbers to open new accounts in my name that they could drain without me noticing immediately. The part about the previous ones was the most disturbing. Galina mentioned this was the family's fourth attempt and that the other three had been successful to varying degrees. One of the guys apparently discovered the scam too late and couldn't recover his money. Another was so emotionally devastated he didn't even press charges, and a third had been somehow compensated to keep him quiet. Emma and I sat there in silence after finishing the translation, both in shock at the enormity of what we had just uncovered. Emma told me I needed to go to the police immediately, that this wasn't just a bad relationship but organized crime, that this family had clearly done this before and would do it again if they weren't stopped. I was paralyzed, honestly. Part of me still couldn't believe that Anastasia, the woman I had planned to spend the rest of my life with, was involved in something like this. But the evidence was there, in her own voice, in her own words. There was no way to misinterpret it or rationalize it. I called my parents that same afternoon. My mother, Nancy, and my father, William, lived in another state like 6 hours away. I told them everything, sent them the recording with Emma's translation. I heard my mother cry on the phone, which was devastating because she rarely cries. My father went into protection mode immediately, saying they would come the next day and that I should pack my things because he was getting me out of that house. I told him I couldn't just leave like that because I needed to gather more evidence, that if I fled now, they could get rid of everything and there would never be justice. I spent the next 3 days acting like everything was normal. It was the hardest performance of my life. I had to sit at dinners with Galina and Pavel. I had to kiss Anastasia and tell her I loved her. I had to pretend I didn't know anything while inside I was dying. But during those 3 days, I collected evidence like crazy. I took photos of documents I found in Pavel's study, papers that had names of other men with bank account numbers and social security numbers. I recorded more conversations, especially one where Galina gave Anastasia specific instructions on how to get my banking passwords. I also contacted a fraud specialist lawyer that Emma recommended. The lawyer, after reviewing the evidence, connected me with a police detective named Henry who worked in a financial crimes unit. Henry came to my office, instead of my house for obvious reasons, and reviewed everything I had collected. He told me I had enough to start an investigation, but they needed more information about the previous victims and about how exactly the family's network operated. The plan we put together was this. My parents would come on a specific day when Anastasia and her parents thought I was at work. I would leave the office early. We would meet at a restaurant half an hour from the house, and from there we would coordinate with the police to get my stuff out and confront the family. Henry said they would have officers present to avoid any violent situation and to arrest the family members if they tried to flee or destroy evidence. The day came. It was a Tuesday in March. I remember perfectly. I left the office at noon saying I had a medical appointment. I met my parents at an Applebee's on the outskirts of town. My mother hugged me and cried again. My father was rigid with contained fury. Henry arrived with another officer, a woman named something like Jennifer or Jessica. I don't remember well. We went over the plan one more time. We were going to the house. I would get my stuff out with my parents' help while the officers talked to Anastasia and her family, and depending on how they reacted, they would proceed with arrests or a more formal search warrant. We arrived at the house around 2 inches the afternoon. Anastasia was there, which was a surprise because she normally worked until 5. Her face, when she saw me with my parents and 2 police officers, was absolute panic. Galina came out of the kitchen screaming in her language, asking what was happening, why there were police in her house. Pavel appeared too, his usually expressionless face now showing obvious fear. Henry took control of the situation, explaining in English that they were investigating allegations of fraud and needed to ask some questions. I went straight to the basement with my parents and we started packing. I could hear Galina screaming upstairs, both in English and in her language, demanding to see a warrant, threatening to call her lawyer, saying this was discrimination and harassment. Anastasia was crying, telling me to come into the house so we could talk, that this was a misunderstanding, that she could explain everything. I didn't speak to her. I literally didn't say a single word. I kept packing while my mother helped me with clothes and my father carried boxes to the car. It took us like an hour to get all the essentials out. When we went upstairs for the last time, Henry asked me to identify some documents they had found in Pavel's study. They were the same papers I had photographed days before, now officially confiscated as evidence. Anastasia tried to approach me one last time, grabbing my arm and begging me to listen to her, that this wasn't what it seemed, that her family was financially desperate but that she really loved me. I pulled my arm away and told her the only thing I said to her. That whole time, I know everything. I have the recordings. Never contact me again. Her face went white. Galina started screaming that I had violated their privacy, that recording conversations was illegal, that she was going to sue me. Henry informed her that in our state, only one person in the conversation needs to know it's being recorded for it to be legal, and that since the conversations were about me, I had every right to record them for my protection. We left that house and I never went back. My parents let me stay with them for a few weeks while I looked for a new apartment. The police investigation continued and was much more extensive than I expected. It turned out that Galina and Pavel had been running this scheme for almost 10 years, using not just Anastasia, but also a niece and another daughter I never met. They had scammed multiple men, mainly guys with good jobs in tech or finance who they met on dating apps. The police managed to track down 2 of the previous victims that Galina had mentioned in the recording. One of them had lost over $80,000 and was so devastated he had developed severe depression and had to move back in with his parents. The other had lost like $50,000, but had also been a victim of identity theft, with credit accounts opened in his name that took him years to resolve. Both testified in the case, which helped establish a pattern of criminal behavior. The case went to trial like a year later. I had to testify, which was horrible because I had to see Anastasia again, sitting there with her family, all of them acting like victims of an unjust system. They presented the recording as primary evidence, along with all the financial documents the police had confiscated, bank transfer records, and testimonies from the other victims. The trial lasted 2 weeks, I think, or maybe 3. It all becomes blurry in my memory. In the end, all 3 were found guilty of multiple charges of fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. Galina received the longest sentence, like 8 years in federal prison, because she was clearly the one organizing everything. Pavel received 6 years. Anastasia received 4 years, although her lawyer argued that she was also a victim manipulated by her mother, which the jury obviously didn't believe given the evidence of her active participation. All 3 were also put on a list for deportation after serving their sentences because none of them were US citizens. The financial part was complicated. I personally didn't lose huge amounts compared to the other victims because I never gave them access to my main accounts. The money I had given them for rent and expenses, probably about $8,000 or $10,000 total, I didn't get back and honestly didn't care. I had my salary intact, my savings intact, my credit intact. Some of the other guys weren't so lucky and are still recovering financially. Emotionally, it was much more complicated, obviously. I was in therapy for almost a year and a half. I had trouble trusting anyone, especially women. Every time someone asked me about my finances or my job, I went into defensive mode immediately. I stopped using dating apps completely. My friends tried to set me up with people, but I always found excuses not to go out. My therapist said I was showing signs of PTSD, which makes sense considering I spent months living with people who were actively planning to financially destroy me while I pretended I trusted them. Now, like 2 years after all that craziness, I'm in a better place, I guess. I moved to a new city to start over, got a better job with a higher salary. I still go to therapy, but less. Frequently, like once a month instead of once a week. I started dating someone a few months ago, a woman I met at the gym, completely organically, no apps or planned dates, just casual conversations that turned into coffees and then dinners. I told her the whole story after like our fifth or sixth date because I felt she needed to know before things got more serious. She listened to everything without interrupting, and at the end just said, "I'm so sorry. That's horrible, but thank you for trusting me enough to tell me." She didn't ask invasive questions or make me feel like a charity project. She just acknowledged it happened and that I'm working on getting over it. That meant more than she probably knows. Did I learn anything from all this? Obviously. I learned that red flags exist for a reason, and that ignoring them because you're in love is basically signing your own sentence. I learned that trusting is okay, but verifying is also necessary. I learned that if something feels wrong, it's probably because it is wrong, and that your instinct usually knows things your rational mind hasn't processed yet. And I learned that there are people in the world who see others as nothing more than opportunities to make money, and that those people can seem normal, kind, even loving, until you discover the truth. The craziest part of all this is that sometimes I still wonder if any part of what Anastasia felt for me was real. Like, was there any moment where she genuinely loved me? Or was it all acting from the first message on that dating app? My therapist says, I'll probably never know the answer and that looking for it will only hurt me. She's right, I guess. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if 5% was real, if 95% was a lie. Last week, I saw a news story about another marriage fraud ring they dismantled in another state. And it all sounded so familiar it gave me chills. It's a bigger problem than people think, apparently. And I was one of the lucky ones, who figured it out before it was too late.